Welcome to another episode of The Watchdog with me, Lowkey. We have just been on the end of the Venezuelan regional and local elections, in which we saw 21 million people participate, and the United Socialist Party, led by Nicolás Maduro, winning 83% of the governorships. We saw 20 out of 23 governor posts go to the ruling party. Now, we must remember that this electoral process was overseen by 300 international observers from 55 different countries. You also had international organizations observing the vote, from the Carter Center to the United Nations to the Latin American Council of Electoral Experts. I'll start that again. You also had the electoral process observed by a host of international organizations, from the Carter Center to the United Nations, the Latin American Council of Electoral Experts, and the European Union. Unfortunately, the US State Department, as usual, sought to stain this election, claiming through Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, that the quote-unquote regime grossly skewed the process to determine the result of this election long before any ballots had been cast. Today, to discuss this victorious election for the United Socialist Party led by Nicolás Maduro, we are joined by Diego Sequera from Misión Verdad and the Samuel Robinson Institute in Venezuela now. Diego, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for joining us today. If you could give us your perspective on these election results.
Well, first of all, it's striking that after so many things we've gone through, especially the last 8 years, basically, ever since this whole new stage in our history started, our history and US history relationship with us started with all the harm that we've gone through and all the impact that the sanctions have, not only economically, but also psychologically, psychically, that how much it has affected the population, how much part of, not an overt statement of the purpose of sanctions is also to disenfranchise people from politics, from political involvement, and also to believe in leadership. And mind you, it's not only a thing about, of course, the main target, it's the Chavista government for several reasons that we can go through afterwards, but also politics in general, as in not being engaged in politics, the Venezuelan society, even with opposition candidates. I mean, it's a general thing. Of course, like I said, it's mostly, of course, focused on undermining Chavismo, but it does go beyond that and goes beyond, let's call it, it's social engineering, basically. It's changing the way you live and the way you view things in order to find, at some point, according to this rationale, the proper conditions for regime change, regardless if it is thanks to the crisis, to the stage-managed crisis, to the artificial induced crisis, to provoke an uprising against the current government, or by any other final result, be it a coup, be it an electoral defeat. It's a variable thing. It depends on how things develop. And it hasn't been so successful as they have been expecting all these years. So we had the participation rate was like 41% of registered voters. And usually, of course, there's like this common trope about saying that's a low figure for Venezuelan elections. But first of all, this is regional elections. Presidential elections will move a way more higher number of voters, and it's actually within the frame of how many people participate in these elections regionally. So yes, in a sense, we can concede that it's not the usual for the Venezuelan dynamic, the electoral dynamic, but still it's within the convention, and especially if you take into account all these elements, as in what we already said, but also the mobility, the migration phenomenon. That's, well, it's in a different stage now. It's not as dramatic as a few years ago, but that also had an impact. And you also have, of course, and we have to acknowledge this, Lowkey, we also have people who didn't go to vote. But you have to understand in which context this happens. So still with that in mind, I think it's a major achievement for the country in general, for the electoral system, for the government and the oppositions that engage in electoral politics to achieve this result. Of course, as we all know, it was a very important victory for the Socialist Party, United Socialist Party of Venezuela, PSUV in Spanish, because of course there has been always still at that level political engagement, political commitment. Maybe not perfect. Of course, it's not perfect. But I don't know. But I can't think of anywhere in the world that politics, daily politics, and electoral politics are just clear cut and perfect. So it's important. Nevertheless, we also had some significant surprises during this outcome. I mean, from the three states that ended up in the opposition's hands with different kind of oppositions, we lost, for example, one state that usually was never lost by Chavismo. I'm talking about the Cojedes state in the western central part, and the other two, Zulia and Nueva Esparta. Zulia at the far west and Nueva Esparta, the island at the eastern part of Venezuela, was quite more predictable. And it did have to do also on how the governors, in the case of Zulia, actually, which was ruled by PSUV until this last election, how they did. And what voters thought about his tenure and why they didn't vote for him. That's also, I think, it's a very healthy sign of voter criteria, of how they state their political stand regarding their own local concerns. Nueva Esparta was a bit different because it's a class thing, basically, because there's this middle high class involvement there, and I guess it didn't just felt secure about the Chavista government, or maybe the rank and file voters of the PSUV didn't vote. I don't know. There's still a lot of analysis to do about the whole phenomenon. But overall, I think it was a pretty healthy elections, especially after so much. So I think, and also we have another interesting aspect, which is the oppositions. We use it in plural because they're not unified. There's not only one opposition. There's several with different tendencies. Participated in new formations. Mind you, new formations and old formations were the ones successful on a governorship level, but also municipality. Also, Chavismo also won most of the main cities. He lost some of them also. And Caracas itself, this main municipality, was also held by Chavismo. So this landscape, this political landscape, sends a clear message that actually that's what makes people like Tony Blinken react the way they did. But in contrast to other elections, this is the first time that not only the usual organizations accompany the Venezuelan elections, but also the EU was part of it after 15 years of not being officially involved in Venezuelan elections. We don't know yet what they're going to say. We're expecting that today. As you know, in Venezuela, it's 9:30 in the morning, so it's something we're going to see throughout the day because of the press conference it's today. So we'll see actually what they got to say. And of course, and also the other thing is that there's been, particular critiques on how to improve some of the aspects of the campaign, political participation, the balance of the parties and so on. And these are recommendations that are always welcomed. It's not a hostile thing. I mean, this has been by all the other organizations. Let's see what now the EU has to say. And we can expect anything in this case, as you well know.
Well, I think it's important for the viewers that we take it back into time when understanding that even the election over the past few days was a grappling with the ghost of Hugo Chavez, and as an interpreter of yearnings for social justice that he was, we see today a lot mobilized against this process of participatory politics within Venezuela on an international level, not just the United States, but the British state also. I think it's essential that we look at how Venezuela went from, prior to Hugo Chavez becoming the leader of the Venezuelan state, you had about 900,000 people in Venezuela with university degrees. But by the time he had passed away, there were over 4 million people with degrees. That's an increase of 344%. The number of students in primary education when he came into power was 500,000 people. By the time he passed away, it was 2.8 million people. That is an increase of 460%. You had people with pensions in Venezuela increasing from about 370,000 people to 3.2 million people after Chavez passed. You went from having 45% school enrollment to, by the time Chavez passed, having 90% school enrollment. What we're talking about is going from a state that spent about 39% of its national income on social investments to becoming a state that spent 74% of its total income on social investments. And that was an achievement of the Bolivarian Revolution. So firstly, if you could break down for us, who was Simón Bolívar and how did he relate to Hugo Chavez?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Lowkey. And those are also good numbers to describe the leap that the Bolivarian Revolution led by El Comandante Chavez was able to achieve in such a short time, and with the minimum amount of, let's call it, violence, because that's one of the particularities of the Venezuelan Revolution. And yes, it always takes us back to a libertador, to Simón Bolívar, who's the father of our country, our history, and also part of the region also, because he not only liberated, as you well know, what we today know as Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Panama, and Bolivia. I mean, he was the founder actually of Bolivia. So a Libertador must be one of the most important figures of the whole 19th century. Even his model inspired Europe, like Italy, for example, the Risorgimento led by Garibaldi, or also Bismarck, about the unification of the different nations that created a major nation. Because also coming back here to Latin America, remember that during the independence process, there wasn't a divided continent. It was always conceived, and by all the liberators, not only Bolívar, as a continental nation, a country of nations, right? So this was a very long process that started in 1810 would be like the starting point of all this. Bolívar being from the high class of the criollos, from the white Venezuelans from Spanish descent, but not acknowledged as Spanish citizens, but of the colonial cities. This was a very long process that actually had several defeats and several failures in how to engage and how to understand this historical moment, until at some point, given how overwhelming class struggle was. I mean, how many people at first, the poor, the peasants, the indigenous, the slaves, didn't acknowledge this set of white people that were calling for independence and actually opposed it. And how during very hard lessons, Simón Bolívar was able to actually understand that you won't have a country unless you abolish slavery, unless all these people that are excluded are involved, and unless you don't create something new of this, what he called like this breed of in the middle of, the ancient Europe and America. So history is alive and well here in Latin America. It's everywhere. It's all, you can see it all the time. and it comes and it reappears in every development. It's always there. I mean, that's something I know it kind of sounds obvious to us, but for some Western citizenship, maybe it's not so obvious, you know. And remember also that memory is something that always ruling elites were going to try to undermine and break, so you disengage with your own origins, with your own history, and your own right to tell your history. So that involvement from Bolivar, I mean, once Venezuela was independent, Bolivar and his generals and his army went forward. I mean, we're talking about now 820 in that decade on up till 824. It was a military campaign that got into the depths of the Andes and was able to liberate all this, and also set a series of laws, for example, that destroyed, for example, the Mita regime, the way that the indigenous people were exploited, also the national resource, and the discussion of unity. The unity facing what should be, because he was also foreseeing this, the enemies of our region, talking especially about, in this case, the US, because already for those years, I mean, I'm paraphrasing here, but there's a famous quote by Bolivar that says that the US is destined by Providence to plague with, death and destruction Latin America on behalf of liberty. And these words are said this is 1824, 25, he says this. And during those years, he also set up the Amphictyonic Congress. It was a congress that was calling to all the nations of Hispanic America, quote unquote, because of our language and our cultural and colonial heritage. And cultural heritage also, I mean, we have to be frank about it. I mean, it has a positive and a negative to it. To unite and to build the highest and brightest civilization humankind have seen. That was Bolivar's aspirations. So he has like this huge geopolitical project with a major, deep social justice one domestically. This, of course, was betrayed. It was betrayed by several ruling class leaders that also participated in independence. And it was also stimulated, mind you, by different foreign offices. And in this case in particular, you can't track UK's role in it, because the whole Latin America jumped from a semi-feudal economy and a rent-seeking economy in the Spanish framework. It jumps to a commercial raw material supplier economy. And it all, of course, delved into, up to that point, to the British system. So a lot of these heroes, for example, I can think about Santander from Colombia, which is like the anti-Bolivar, were actually pretty close and were very involved with British agents and and also US agents, and how to undermine this unity and how to keep a say here. So this historical evolution was suspended in time. So during the decades up to this point, all the major cycles of insurgency, reivindication, of revolution, of reform that the country has gone through, not only Venezuela, but other places, had the presence and the ideas and the philosophy of Bolivar within its belief, like always retaking where Bolivar and the liberators left and bring it to the present. This is something that also happened throughout the 20th century. And it's not different from El Comandante Chavez. The difference is then in the 90s, the ruling elite had succeeded in their own project of, as domesticating the historical figure. And, there's a song that says that all the people yearly went to your mausoleum to make sure you're dead. That was Ali Primera's song. And it's basically like that. So Bolivar also, Chavez, well, it's good to mix them because there's a big continuity between both. Chavez brought the persecuted memory of Bolivar that actually was always in people, in the common people's heart and mind and beliefs. This is an important sign because that's why, of course, the Bolivarian Revolution was the name. He brought him back. Even, for example, Lowkey, his movement was called Movimiento Bolivariano Revolucionario 200 when the February 4th, 1992 military uprising. When during that process, after his release in 1994, he was able to, they decided by their own assembly deliberations to go into, regardless of the risks, into conventional electoral politics. The electoral laws banned the name of Bolivar. You couldn't, as a party, you couldn't use the Bolivar's name in your party's name. So that's why it was called then Movimiento Quinta República, Fifth Republic. MBR, but was a different B. And it was also the center of it because the country needed to be overhauled. It needed to be readdressed. The Constitution had to actually reflect what the country was and what were the desires and needs of the society and everything that was suspended in time. All the historical depths with the Venezuelan people. That's at the also front and center of Chavismo origin. In a time that the ruling elites were actually, we already gone through through hardcore neoliberal reforms, structural adjustments, and so on since the 80s, since 88, 89 especially, and so on. Also, this is also important, Lowkey. I had to say it because it's good to remind people that February the 27th of 1989, before Chavez and the other commandantes uprising in 92, this was the first actual mobilization against the IMF, against neoliberalism. No one actually talks about it. It was the first, at least in the Western Hemisphere. This is also important because this also describes the Venezuelan spirit against this kind of injustice. So I'm going this back to bring forward all this historical accumulation in a country that had 20% of people that were living well and feeding themselves and getting educated against 80% in poverty and 40% of extreme poverty. Those were the numbers when El Comandante arrived into office. He was elected in 98. He was re-elected in 99 after they sanctioned by vote the new constitution, the Fifth Republic, they would call it. And that's where the process started, the peaceful one. But then the reaction came. The furies of history had a say also. So the oligarchy, the Fourth Republic oligarchy, and the managerial elite of the oil industry set up the 2002 coup. This was the turning point, the first turning point of many, but a very significant one because it was a counter coup. It was a coup in April 11, 2002 that was staged by media and that was thwarted 47 hours afterwards thanks to popular mobilization. After that moment, Chavez and the leadership understood that, well, we can't do everything, by consent. Some things have to be via the constituent power. So that's when Chavez actually starts to radicalize the revolution. That's when the social missions happen. As you know, the social missions, the first social missions basically focused on education and literacy. We had actually, which is acknowledged, for example, John Pilger called it the biggest literacy campaign in history. And in very few years, illiteracy, which was pretty high, was completely eradicated, for example. The other stages of these missions were about school, finishing school, and then university for people that never had the chance of studying. So you had people 80 years old finishing their school, their high school, and then starting a university career, for example. The other social mission was so important was Barrio Adentro. Barrio Adentro would translate something like in the worker class neighborhoods, inside which was the medical missions that was supported. Both were supported significantly by Cuba, but in the case of the healthcare system, it was decisive also. So once you took people out of hell, out of exclusion, out of desperation, you're now able to discuss a country. What kind of country do you want to be? How do you want to relate yourself with your neighbors? What can you do? Because this is our heritage, for your neighbors, for your brothers and sisters outside of what conventionally is known Venezuela. And also succeeding in this via the elections. This is the difference between, some other revolutionary process, such as Nicaragua or Cuba. They had no other option other than the military option, and they succeeded. And that's also the particular, and so Venezuela is halfway between that and, of course, Chile, Allende's Chile, as a peaceful revolution that arrived into power through elections.
Now, for sorry.
Mm-hmm. Go on.
Sorry, continue.
No, go ahead.
Brother. I was just going to say... Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, go ahead, please do. Your turn.
I was going to say that for those in English-speaking societies who are, in a very sophisticated way, depoliticized, demobilized, and divorced from history, their only vision and image of Hugo Chavez was the speech he gave to the United Nations on the 20th of September 2006. Now, bear in mind that he had taken the Venezuelan national income from about $14 billion in 1998 to about $40 billion in 2006. If you can just describe for us what this speech at the United Nations was exactly and what the context of that speech was.
Well, that was, 2006. The most famous phrase, it was when Chavez reaches the podium and he looks around, he makes a cross sign and said, it smells sulfur here. The devil was here recently. It was because Bush George W. Bush was the president back then, and was the person that was they gave his speech not too long ago. And it's also when Chavez started going to this new social order and bearing from experience of how the Venezuelan model was able to achieve what it achieved, and how the world is able to achieve this in the order also to, regardless, in spite of the hegemon. Actually, he also recommended a Chomsky book back there and during that speech that became a bestseller afterwards. Chavez was also a huge book promoter. If you remember, also he gave to Obama the Las Venas Abiertas de América Latina by Eduardo Galeano.
Yeah.
So in this context, we're talking about the moment when one of the highest moments in the Bolivarian revolution. Some objective elements are also favored this. For example, the commodity prices. But you have to be a sharp politician to actually make the best of that situation and invest it properly where it should be invested in a country. And we're talking about, of course, like you said, social investment in this case. But you have another element that you can track a few years before that. You had to rehabilitate, for example, in our case of being an oil-producing country, the OPEC, because it was absolutely depressed and the price of oil was the lowest. Chavez even walked through the Jordanian border into Iraq to meet Saddam Hussein when he was blocked and sanctioned and so on, just to reactivate and to put in the map the OPEC one more time after being basically dismantled. Also remember that by 2006, the dynamization of the oil industry, which was the code word for privatization, was completely reversed. And so it became absolutely sovereign. The whole oil process, the whole oil producing process from extraction to the end product in Venezuela, with all the connected services, and also with a fair share with private enterprises. Except that it didn't went full public against private sector, just struck a different balance that actually benefited Venezuelan sovereignty. That year, by the way, Chavez it wasn't the highest, but for that, up till that moment, he won over a 60% overwhelming victory against Manuel Rosales, the opposition candidate. it was too good to be true, Lowkey, in a way. And a year after that, we can see what happened and how the U.S. tried to change the rise of Venezuela and the impact that Venezuela not only had in Latin America, but also in the rest of the global South. I mean, for Chavez, it was a priority to open and to have a dynamic and active trade and diplomatic relationships with Africa, for example, with West Asia, with Russia, etc., to build an alternative model that actually was close. And then he assumed it's the start of multipolarity. That's 2006. So empire had to do something about it. And now, acknowledging that the usual means didn't succeed as a conventional coup. There's a Venezuelan intellectual here that said that the first casualties of Iraq fell in Puente Llaguno, in Venezuela downtown in 2002. And I think that also explains the relationship between what the urgency was of overthrow Chavez and keep the region in line, and also in part of this demented neocon expansion of those years. So something had to be done, but the usual political class wasn't available. The military was also revolutionized under Chavez's rule. So all the old guard that was all too involved with the US and the UK and other Western powers was out of the picture. They became just conspirators and part of all the constant conspiracy and coup that Venezuela gone through. And so you had to find something else. So in 2007, mid-2007, we witnessed a new generation of quote-unquote students that appeared under the limelight, of the public limelight. These were all upper-class, right-wing students that set up a series of uprisings clearly under the Otpor rationale, on the color revolution, gene-sharp methodology of nonviolent struggle. In this and this is my generation we're talking about, by the way, because I was in the same age group that all this happened, and this included a generation of kids by then, not so kids anymore, that included Juan Guaidó among them. We're talking about an astroturfed color revolution with Serbian, Italian, Spanish, US trained cadres that assumed all the methods that were successful in the post-Soviet space and brought it into the fold in Venezuela. And I can say also that it partially succeeded that day, because the surprise factor was important there. And we had that year, 2007, we had an election for a constitutional reform that would even speed up the conditions for Venezuela to become a socialist state, because in 2006, that was the moment that Chavez declared the Bolivarian revolution as socialist. In 2004, he declared anti-imperialist, but in 2006, towards 2007, he declared it also as a 21st century socialist project.
It's also important to clarify for people that Generation 2007, of which Juan Guaidó emerged out of, was funded by USAID, the National Endowment of Democracy, the US's arm, essentially.
And also Open Society Foundations. Yes,
exactly.
Yes, that's important, because you have all the usual suspects doing what they do.
Yeah.
And also that's the year that started the whole charges of drug trafficking and so on also started. So we have this huge character assassination campaign that, yes, it was against Chavez, it was against the Chavista government, but it was, of course, a collective character assassination, because it was all against us also.
Yeah.
So that, by a very short margin, these elections, the constitutional election, the reform election for 2006 was by a very slight margin, it was defeated. It was the first electoral defeat of Chavismo in how many elections back then? Huge, for several years. and that set the tone for what would come afterwards. Still, during these years, we had a very that didn't stop. For example, the wages to rise, to social conditions to improve, to have a lot of opportunities in studying and work. Also, the state was also a major employer for people. This created a quality of life that showed something that's fundamental for people to understand, because it wasn't only struggling for all these higher purposes and all these objectives and the continuity of the Bolivarian project, but people started finally to live well, to have a real life, to create and to conquer their own kind of normalcy. This is important because revolution, it's not a spectacular thing. Sometimes it can be pretty boring, sometimes it's anti-spectacular, sometimes it's frustrating. And if you don't have this element to it, what's revolution for? What social changes are for, you know? What does it mean? This is extremely important because this sets the stage of what came afterwards.
So
Chavez's last election, he won. Yeah, go on.
Sorry, just leading on from that. If you could tell us about the self-proclaimed interim president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido.
Yes, I have to give a short context. I'm not gonna expand that much, but just to give a bit of an element here. After El Comandante's death in 2013, the whole approach of the U.S. changed. And it was also based on the template that was already applied in West Asia and Northern Africa, because there was that kind of indirect approach. So first, they tried to do it via hybrid warfare, the combination of color revolution with unconventional warfare, as in economic sabotage, diplomatic sabotage, financial sabotage. This is before sanctions, mind you, because first they already attacked our own weaknesses in the economy to deform the situation and play it for themselves and in their favor. But all these crazy adventures from 2013-14 up to 2018, they didn't succeed. They failed miserably. But the thing about that is that, of course, it brought some pain, but it wasn't able to actually regime change Venezuela. So in 2019, they came up with a new formula, which is basically, look, the only thing we got, it's a National Assembly, which they won it fair and square, and it was acknowledged. It was I think the most important defeat of the whole history of Chavismo. But they threw away all the political capital in a very short time. This is 2015. At the end of middle 2016, it's all their political capital was gone, and so they have to rely one more time on the indirect approach. The economy, the foreign policy, sanctions had already started, and so on. So when in 2019, there's no other option, all these crazy options, in the Trump administration with John Bolton and Pompeo and also Marco Rubio with the neocons, the reality creators that they think they are, thought that this was going to be the best option to create basically a parallel structure, parallel state, a parastate, a shadow government, and to traumatically transfer sovereignty into this new structure, regardless with a very thin-veiled legal interpretation that's actually pretty flawed, but nevertheless they don't care about it as long as it succeeds. So this is when this kid comes from, Juan Guaido, and a second-rate politician, because all the first-rate had two things. Or they were outside Venezuela. They could be also in jail, like Leopoldo Lopez, which is it's not a political. He never was a political prisoner. He was a politician in jail, which is also different because he had to face criminal charges. And you had people also the leadership, the young leadership wasn't appealing enough in their own mindset on who knows what focus group came to this conclusion to say we need someone with mestizo features, with dark skin, with a different, not so obvious background like all these other kids. So that's why they also thought about Juan Guaido. And also the youth fetish, because all of I'm sorry, but youth in general, it's overrated this time. And it's a major battlefield. And these elections also prove that, because none of that new generation of politicians actually achieved anything. That's important to also to address. So the thing is that Bolton, Rubio, Pompeo, Abrams, and so on were actually the opposition was like the extremist opposition was like guaranteeing that doing this would make the Chavista government collapse in less than 2 months. And Trump's administration basically fell for it. And being the US, he was able to, bring him to force him to go through the same line. Of course, they're the usual suspects in that case. The European countries, Israel, some African countries, just two, Rwanda and Morocco, Taiwan, I don't know, their own people to follow this political, what soon afterwards became a political vacuum. So Juan Guaido, other than grifting, because it wasn't only this political representation, there was also the major concern, which was how to take control of how much we could take control of Venezuelan assets in the oil industry, its savings in foreign banks, and so on. That's why they kidnapped Citgo, which is the U.S. branch of the state oil company in the U.S. It has several refineries there, several gas stations. The same with Monomeros, which is in Colombia, which was it's a fertilizer and other plastic oil derived factory. It's also a major, big, important asset. And also our savings in several bank accounts. In this case, I think the most explicit one, the most obscene of them all, of course, it's our 31 tons of gold in the vaults of the Bank of England. So thanks to this technicality they created out of the blue, the Western powers were able to take all these assets and use it in their advantage. And also, we're talking about millions, and we're talking about billions of dollars here, Lowkey, that actually partially funded all this misadventure, because you also had like a major funds from the USAID that were destined to other, for example, to Haiti and in Africa and so on. They were destined for those. It was allocated for those countries, and it ended up in the whole Guaido adventure.
Well, I mean,
so you have the. Go on.
So sorry to interrupt. I mean, the thing with the gold in the Bank of England is it's estimated to be worth $2 billion. Now, when they looked at how much it would cost over a year to import medical, medicine and food to Venezuela, it was about $2.1 billion. So in a way, as John McAvoy made the point to me last week, it's equivalent to removing a year's worth of medical and food imports from the country. And as he put it, within a wider context of suffocating sanctions, it is tantamount to institutionalized murder. On top of that, we know that John, in his brilliant work, revealed the Venezuela Reconstruction Unit within the British Foreign Office. Now, this was a secret unit working on the coup and the restructuring of the Venezuelan economy, quote unquote, post-coup. Now, despite the fact that his revelation sparked a diplomatic crisis, it was raised at the United Nations and even inside British Parliament, it was completely ignored by the mainstream media. If you could point, especially for the viewers of this show, to more of the ways in which Britain has been intimately involved in these mechanisms against Venezuelan sovereignty?
Yes, well, Britain has always been quite stealthy in its involvement in Latin America during the 20th century, until it isn't. And I'm saying until it isn't because suddenly you don't know what they're doing, and suddenly they just steal 31 tons worth of gold from one of their banks. And so they overtly show their true face and their true purpose and their true intentions with Venezuela. They also shaped, and I think that's also something that John McEvoy also in his wonderful work exposed, all this influence campaign, all this communications campaign that were also allocated through several projects funded by the Foreign Office to manage perception about the legitimacy of all they were doing. This now has been revealed, but it wasn't that clear to us. And you have another element here that's pretty important, and it has to do with history. Once more time. One of the major conflicts that Venezuela recently has right now is with Guyana, our neighbor Guyana, former British colony, part of the Commonwealth. We have been, since late 19th century, have a territorial dispute over the Essequibo River, the Essequibo territory, which is a huge, I'm talking about close to 400,000 square kilometers of land that were actually under Venezuela's limits and maps. And during the 19th century, the British started suppressing these lines until they basically created this political void between Venezuela and for what back then was already still its colony of Guyana. Because what? Because of resources, because of the gold reserves, and now because of the offshore oil reserves. This has been a constant throughout the whole 20th century, and suddenly, from 2015 on, it has been a major source of conflict between Venezuela and its neighbor, and also between ExxonMobil's intent to grab all this oil reserves, and by conceding this, putting aside all the legal disputes that has been involved through all these years, that was British created, into this point in which they basically tried to steal and try to forget all this. We're also relying on a political class in Guyana that actually it's all too close to the US and the UK. So you have all those elements. So one of the major conflicts it was created by the Brits more than over 100 years ago. So you have all this presence, and you also have, for example, the current ambassador here. She's trying to play this influencer role, and she takes pictures in some of Venezuelan classic touristical sceneries and places, or also some that are not affordable to common Venezuelans, and talking about all this wonders of Venezuela and acknowledging Juan Guaidó still as the president of Venezuela. So you have that constant element there that after all the Guaidó misadventure fizzled out, these countries, the US, UK, and some of the European countries still need to keep Juan Guaidó there as their own the leader, and their own, and how they understand how should Venezuela be understood by all the people. You also have the same kind of campaign with the Essequibo. There are a lot of interests. It was also revealed, I think it was by Declassified UK, in the Essequibo, how they also manage the perception about the legitimacy or not, or the objective discussion of what's actually going on there, and who are actually politically responsible for that mess. So that's the thing. You have the UK involvement. Usually, it's covert until it becomes suddenly overt in all Latin America. And I think John McEvoy's work in this sense, it's paramount. It has been so helpful for us throughout all these years.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, we have to acknowledge that, and we have to thank him for what he's doing.
Absolutely, 100%. And also, one of the other things that Declassified revealed was the revolving door between the highest level of British intelligence and oil companies like Shell, BP, and Exxon Mobil.
Yes.
You have seen people go from the very top of British intelligence agencies and the British military to go on to have roles in those companies. So we cannot treat that as a benign relationship. We know that there is an intertwining and an integration of those
Absolutely,
mechanisms.
absolutely.
One of, just before the last question I wanted to ask, and we may not have enough time to really deal with it deeply, but it's very important that we talk about it. The UN Special Rapporteur found that today Venezuela's national income is actually 1% of what it was prior to sanctions. Can you please break down the human cost of the sanctions on Venezuela, please?
Yeah, man, it has been so harmful. Remember 10 years ago, 12 years ago, perhaps, Venezuela had the highest wage in all Latin America. It was around $500. And now the public wage is around $2 or $3. It's worth its value. It's so. You inhibited the possibility to renew your debts and your financial commitments in order to buy medicine and to buy food and to buy all the goods that Venezuela wasn't actually producing and what didn't have actually either the chance to diversify its economy and produce it itself. It's already happening now, regardless of all this full-blown aggression against Venezuela. Last year, the oil revenue dropped to 99%, Lowkey, of its usual income. And still, this year, the social spending, the social planning, the social investment, so it's still way up in over 70%. So this tells you how much space that we've lost, but still we've been able to hold the line. People have died from lack of medicine, from lack of funding for complex operations, from transplants, and then to travel, because there was several programs. One of them was stolen by the Guaido shadow government of paying. The Citgo used to have the Simón Bolívar Foundation, which used to pay high complexity health cases. They funded the patients, and they took it to. They paid the trip to any other clinic anywhere in the world. They were going to actually, with the best specializations on the matter, and attend this kind of case. Lots of people have died for that. Also, our own foreign reserves have dropped so dramatically that the past years, all the economy basically came into a halt. All the industries dropped to zero. I'm talking 2017, 18, 19. Of course, 19 was a very weak moment. That's why they throw out the whole Guaido adventure also happens. This, you can address up to some extent the mismanagement, or there are mistakes or structural weaknesses being a primary, an oil producer, an oil relied state that's always been dependent state, no? But this massive overhaul of our own livelihood, it's impossible, even by the worst case mismanagement. Even the Cubans, for example, say that they did to Venezuela in 4 years what they did to them in 30 years. This is to give you, this is said by the Cubans, that they know very well know how the impact of sanctions has on the society. This is how, to give you an idea how aggressive, how the full-blown aggression has been and how far it has gotten. Nevertheless, Venezuela has always found a way to at least stop the huge amount of people from dying, from starving, through our own through their own, our own, because it's in Venezuela, the food programs that the Venezuelan government established, the local committees of storage and production, the CLAP, Comités Locales de Abastecimiento y Producción, which basically it organizes at a community level the families to via their own that are registered to receive a monthly supply of food basics and sometimes other goods, but overall it's usually, well, you have the staple food, as in corn flour, as in grain, as in sometimes sugar, sometimes coffee, sometimes sardine. I mean, maybe not enough protein, and that's always been a struggle. But there's also ways today they try to bring out to also accompany with basic proteins. But this project has one of them. It has been decisive to hold the line and to stop the slow motion genocide we're going through. Because this, Alfred de Sayas, also special rapporteur of the UN, also called this genocide based on the Rome Statutes. So we're talking about, this is legally genocide.
Yeah.
The difference is it's not full-blown genocide. So Venezuela has actually find a way to circumvent the sanctions, circumvent as far as it can the financial system in order to do that. And this brings us, I think, so to what could be the next subject we have to talk about, because we had a hero within this process that was able actually to bring to Venezuela medical goods, food, and also construction material during this years of full-blown blockade.
So Alex Saab,
and we're talking about him.
Yeah, if you can break down for us the case of Alex Saab, please.
Yes, Alex Saab, it's a businessman. He's a Colombian-Venezuelan businessman that has been working with the Venezuelan state for a long time, that didn't run away in his relationship with Venezuela. And he actually...
And it's also important to remember that during fighting in Colombia, 5 million Colombians came into Venezuela and found refuge there.
Yeah, that's fundamental because, I mean, it has always been that way. There's no one Venezuelan that doesn't have at some point, some relative that's from Colombia. Even myself, I mean, at least one relative. It could be a, in-law relative or blood, but Colombian history is very, very well embedded in Venezuela's history also. Yes, that's the actual number, because they ran away of the silent civil war, the silent war against the poor, the Colombian poor, the agrarian counter reform that Colombia has always been, and so on. So yes, this was sanctuary for many Colombians. And that's also important to state, because now they're trying to say like Colombia is like a major humanitarian receptor of Venezuelan refugees and so on. But
they didn't say it the other way. And they definitely didn't say it the other way when it was the truth.
And it's something, exactly. And it's a 40 years reality. It's not something from just 3 years ago. It's a 40 years reality. And that's also important to address. So back to Saab. Saab started also to, via his own connections, to set up a network to bring all these staple goods for the CLAP and all these elements. Mind you that they're charging him of, of the 8 charges, they dropped 7, by the way, in Florida, not because that's another thing, he's kidnapped now. We will get to. The thing is that he was able, as a special envoy of the Venezuelan government, especially with Iran and Russia, to find a way to circumvent sanctions and purchase all this goods for Venezuela. And sometimes, sometimes he was from his own money. This is important. This shows you how the will of this guy. It was admirable for us, because sometimes he has, okay, I'll pay and then you pay me. It's the Venezuelan state. I mean, this detail, I think it's fundamental to understand also, because it's not only a matter of winning, of earning. It has its own commitment. So in June last year, Saab was flying to Iran. He was in a flight to Iran, and he stopped in Cape Verde, in Western Africa, the small insular nation, and to refuel basically, and to go to Iran and to buy, especially appliances, medical appliances focused on COVID, biosecurity, and so on. But he was detained there by the Cape Verdean police, and he was kidnapped. And they justified this detention via an Interpol warrant that was actually issued a day after he was detained in Cabo Verde. So this became one of those long-arm jurisdiction moments of the U.S. that uses a small country with its allies and also the pressure and the blackmail to detain this guy, put him in jail, start a crazy legal battle that by all criteria of all the judicial bars in Africa, also by ECOWAS, the Economic Community of Western Africa, it's absolutely illegal, and they were demanding for his release. And same with the UN. I mean, all the major bodies, regional and multilateral, were saying that the detention and kidnapping of Alex Saab was illegal. So, and it became an extradition battle. An extradition between two countries that don't have extradition, mind you, between Cape Verde and the US. So where's the legal framework of all this? It's all might makes right case. So political context in Cape Verde was going to change, and they're going and the new and the expected, which became actually the elected president of Cabo Verde, was actually part of his campaign was to release Alex Saab because of the unlawfulness of this case. A day before that happened, we're talking about we're talking about mid-October. A day before the elections, the U.S. basically kidnapped Alex Saab and took him and took him to Florida to be prosecuted under a South Florida court. So that's where we at right now. But Alex Saab never used the U.S. financial system in order to make any of these businesses he got involved to. So what the U.S. is actually doing here, other than punishing directly Saab, he's punishing the whole country to being able to find a way to not die, to not starve. This is the major thing here. Because you can say, of course, it has been accompanied by a major character assassination campaign against Saab as a criminal and so on, whatever. It's not about that, man. It's basically about disciplining the Venezuelan society, putting them into line that you're not allowed to save yourself until you change your own political view, your geopolitical position, unless you do something else with all your resources. That's the bottom line of Alex Saab kidnapping.
Well said. Thank you so much, Diego. It's been brilliant speaking to you. I hope that we can speak to you again, and it would be great to stay connected, and peace, respect, and solidarity to you, brother. Anything you need from this side, we're here.
Same with Venezuela. And you're also welcome to come as soon as possible, whenever you can, okay?
Would love that, bro.